There's a moment that almost no one talks about. It's when things are finally moving forward, but instead of excitement, you feel tired, unsure, even tempted to walk away. You tell yourself this shouldn't feel this heavy, but it does. And the confusion is quiet, private, hard to explain. Most people assume this feeling means something is wrong. But by the end of this video, you'll understand why this feels the way it does and what it's actually pointing toward. My name is Tony, and I spend way too much time thinking about how money, psychology, and identity all collide, and how understanding that collision can quietly change your life. If you're tired of vague advice and ready to see things more clearly, subscribe and like if this video makes you feel understood. Now, let's talk about what's really happening here. There's a very specific moment that's easy to miss. Nothing dramatic happens. No big win, no big failure. Just a quiet internal shift where something feels different. You're still doing the same work, showing up, trying, moving forward. But the way it feels inside has changed. Here's the thing, most people don't notice this moment right away. They just feel a low-level discomfort they can't name, a heaviness that wasn't there before. And that confusion can be unsettling because from the outside, things might actually be improving. Think about that for a second. This is usually the point where people start asking themselves strange questions. Why do I feel less motivated now? Why does this feel harder when I'm closer than I've ever been? This shouldn't feel like this, should it? And when there's no clear answer, the mind looks for a simple explanation. Maybe I'm burned out. Maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I should stop. But nothing has gone wrong. What you're feeling isn't failure. It's transition. Psychologists talk about something called anticipatory stress, the tension that appears not when something bad happens, but when something meaningful starts to become real. When effort turns into consequence. When actions begin to matter in a more permanent way. Before this point, you were mostly surviving, trying things, experimenting, hoping. If it didn't work out, you could always walk away. But now there's something at stake. It's like the difference between carrying an empty box and carrying something fragile. The weight isn't dramatically heavier, but your body responds differently. Your grip tightens. Your steps slow down. You become more aware of every movement. That's what this moment is. Progress quietly changes the emotional rules. And your nervous system notices before your logic does. This is why the confusion feels so personal, because nothing on the outside clearly explains it. Friends might even say, "But you're doing so well," and that can make you feel even more isolated, like you're ungrateful, or broken, or missing something obvious. But here's the reality most people don't realize. This discomfort is often the first sign that your identity is starting to update. Your old self was built for effort without certainty. Your new situation is asking for something different: responsibility, consistency, direction, and the space between those two versions of you. That space feels unstable. Imagine standing with one foot on the shore and one foot on a boat that's just starting to drift. You're not falling, but you're not fully steady either. That tension doesn't mean you should jump back onto land. It means you're in the middle of something. And this is important because many people quit here not because they're weak, but because they misinterpret the signal. They assume discomfort means danger, that hesitation means misalignment, when in reality, it often means importance. This is the moment where effort starts to carry meaning, where progress becomes personal, where outcomes feel closer and therefore heavier. And once you understand that this is a natural stage, not a personal flaw, the question quietly shifts. Not, "What's wrong with me?" but "Why does my brain react like this when things begin to matter?" And that's where we need to go next. By the time you start questioning yourself, your brain has already made a quiet decision. Not consciously, not logically, but biologically. That's important to understand, because most people assume their hesitation comes from doubt or lack of clarity. But more often, it comes from something much older: the nervous system reacting before the mind has words. Here's the thing. Your brain didn't evolve to chase fulfillment. It evolved to keep you alive. For a long time, what you were doing felt relatively safe. Struggling, trying, pushing. Even if it was uncomfortable, it was familiar. Familiarity is calming to the nervous system even when it's painful. But when progress starts to appear, something subtle changes. Now there's momentum. Now there's visibility. Now there's the possibility of loss. And your brain notices that immediately. Think about that for a second. Psychologists call this loss aversion, the idea that the brain experiences potential loss more intensely than potential gain. The closer something valuable feels, the more protective the nervous system becomes. Before, there wasn't much to lose. Now there is. So the brain scans for risk. What if this doesn't last? What if I mess it up? What if people expect more from me now? And because these questions are uncomfortable, the brain tries to reduce exposure. It pulls back motivation. It creates fatigue. It introduces hesitation, not to sabotage you, but to protect you. This is where people get confused. They think fear means misalignment. That anxiety means they're on the wrong path. But anxiety often shows up not when something is wrong, but when something is new and consequential. Imagine walking through a dark room you've memorized. You don't think about each step. You just move. Now imagine walking through a room filled with glass objects you care about. You slow down. You become hyper-aware. Your body tightens. That tension isn't a sign you shouldn't be there. It's a sign that what you're carrying matters. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between emotional risk and physical risk very well. Visibility feels like exposure. Responsibility feels like danger. Growth feels like uncertainty. So it activates the same systems it would if you were stepping into a risky environment. Heart rate shifts. Focus narrows. Energy gets conserved. This is why progress can suddenly feel exhausting even when the workload hasn't changed. Nothing has gone wrong. Your brain is simply recalibrating to a new reality. There's also something else happening here that most people never realize. Your identity is lagging behind your circumstances. You might be earning more, being taken more seriously, moving closer to something you once wanted, but internally, you're still operating from the version of you that learned how to survive uncertainty, not how to sustain stability. So when the external world starts reflecting a new version of you, the internal system hesitates. It's like wearing shoes you've outgrown. They still work, but every step feels slightly off. That discomfort isn't a failure to adapt. It is adaptation. Research on identity transition shows that people often experience the most stress not at the beginning of change, but during the middle when the old identity no longer fits and the new one hasn't fully formed. You're not going backward. You're in between. And that in-between state is where logic feels weak and emotion feels loud. So if you've noticed yourself pulling away right as things begin to matter, if motivation dips when stakes rise, if fear shows up without a clear reason, that doesn't mean you're incapable. It means your nervous system is catching up to your reality. And once you understand that, something else becomes clear. The discomfort isn't coming from struggle anymore. It's coming from progress. And that's where things start to feel heavier, not because you're failing, but because you're no longer just surviving. And that's what we need to talk about next. At some point, the struggle changes texture. It's no longer loud or chaotic. It becomes quiet, densey, heavy. And that's confusing because struggle is what you know how to handle. Here's the thing. Struggle has rules. Progress doesn't. When you're struggling, your job is simple. Endure. Get through the day. Solve the next problem. React. There's clarity in that, even if it hurts. But progress asks for something different. It asks for ownership. Think about that for a second. When nothing is working, expectations are low. Mistakes feel temporary. Walking away always feels possible. But when things start to move forward, effort stops being disposable. Time feels more expensive. Choices feel heavier. Now your decision counts. And that shift alone can feel overwhelming. Psychologists often describe this as the move from survival mode to responsibility mode. In survival, the nervous system is focused on short-term relief. In responsibility, It's asked to consider long-term consequence, something it's much less comfortable with. That's why progress feels heavier than struggle. Struggle is reactive. Progress is deliberate. Imagine carrying a backpack filled with clothes you don't care about. You can toss it down, drag it, replace it. Now imagine carrying a box with something fragile inside. The weight might be the same, but your body behaves completely differently. You slow down, you tense up, you become careful. That care is exhausting if you're not used to it. Most people don't realize this, but fatigue often increases after improvement, not before. Not because the work is harder, but because the emotional responsibility is new. You're no longer just trying, you're maintaining. And maintenance requires a different identity. This is where people start romanticizing the past. When things were simpler, when pressure was lower, when failure felt less personal. Not because life was better, but because expectations were lighter. And when that nostalgia shows up, it can quietly distort perception. It whispers that maybe you were happier before, that maybe pushing forward is costing you something important. But here's what's actually happening. Your nervous system is adjusting to caring. Caring means there's something to protect, something to preserve, something you don't want to lose. And caring is vulnerable. So the mind looks for escape routes, procrastination, distraction, quitting, not as self-sabotage but as relief. Nothing has gone wrong. This is what happens when effort starts to matter. There's also a subtle grief here that most people never name. The grief of outgrowing the version of yourself that could operate without stakes. That version of you was scrappy, flexible, unattached. The new version has to be steadier, more consistent, more patient, and that transition can feel like losing something even when you're gaining more than you ever had. It's like standing between two worlds. One where survival defined you, and one where direction is required. And standing there feels uncomfortable because you can't fully relax in either place. So if you've been wondering why forward motion feels heavier than backward struggle, why improvement brought pressure instead of relief, why responsibility feels more draining than chaos, that's not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're crossing a threshold. And once you see that, another question starts to emerge. If progress feels heavy because your identity hasn't caught up yet, what happens when the outside world starts treating you like someone you don't fully feel like inside? That's where the real tension begins. There's a strange tension that appears once progress becomes visible. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly uncomfortable. It's the feeling of being seen as someone you don't fully feel like yet. Here's the thing. The world updates its expectations faster than your identity updates its self-image. So while your circumstances are changing internally, you're still orienting yourself, still catching up, still adjusting. Think about that for a second. You might notice people treating you differently, listening more closely, expecting consistency, assuming confidence, and none of that feels bad, but it feels unfamiliar. This is the invisible identity gap, the space between who you've been and who the world thinks you are becoming. Psychologists have noticed that during periods of upward transition, people often experience a kind of internal dissonance, not because they're unworthy, but because identity is slower to adapt than behavior or results. Your actions have changed faster than your self-concept, so there's a mismatch. On the outside, things look aligned. On the inside, something still feels unfinished. It's like wearing a jacket that technically fits but doesn't feel like yours yet. You keep adjusting it, pulling at the sleeves, wondering if people can tell you're uncomfortable. That discomfort doesn't usually show up as fear. It shows up as hesitation. You might delay decisions you're capable of making. Second-guess progress you've earned. Downplay wins before anyone else can acknowledge them. Not because you want to fail, but because part of you is trying to buy time. Time for the inside to catch up with the outside. Most people don't realize this, but this is where subtle self-sabotage often appears. Not in obvious ways, not in destructive ones. In quiet ways. Missing opportunities you're ready for. Stalling momentum just enough to feel safe again. Creating reasons to slow down. And this is important because none of that is about discipline or mindset. It's about alignment. Your nervous system is asking a simple question: is this who we are now? And until it feels safe answering yes, it keeps things slightly unstable. Imagine standing with one foot in your old life and one foot in your new one. You're not fully grounded anywhere. So your body tenses not to stop you, but to stabilize you. Nothing has gone wrong. This identity gap isn't a flaw, it's a buffer, a psychological holding space where your sense of self reorganizes. Research on identity formation shows that people integrate new roles most slowly when those roles come with visibility, responsibility, or permanence. The higher the stakes, the longer the internal adjustment. So if you've noticed yourself pulling back right as you're being pulled forward, if progress feels oddly fragile, if confidence feels conditional instead of solid, that doesn't mean you're pretending. It means you're integrating. And integration is quieter than motivation, slower than ambition, more emotional than logical. This is also why quitting feels tempting here. Walking away would collapse the gap instantly. Old identity restored, tension gone. But growth doesn't ask you to erase who you were. It asks you to expand who you are. And expansion always feels unstable before it feels natural. So if you're feeling stretched, not broken, that matters. Because once this gap begins to close, once the internal picture starts matching the external reality, the discomfort changes again. It doesn't disappear, but it transforms. And that transformation often brings you to the most emotionally intense point of the entire process. The moment where staying feels just as scary as leaving. And that's what we need to talk about next. There's a point where the tension stops being subtle. It doesn't explode, it tightens. You feel it when staying starts to feel just as uncomfortable as leaving. When moving forward feels risky, but stopping feels disappointing. Here's the thing. This is usually the moment people remember when they say, "I don't know why I quit. I just couldn't do it anymore." Think about that for a second. This isn't a lack of strength. It's a collision. On one side is safety, familiar rhythms, predictable identity. On the other side is growth, visibility, responsibility that doesn't turn off. And your nervous system is standing right in the middle. Psychologists describe this moment as an approach avoidance conflict, when the same thing you want is also the thing that scares you. Success promises relief and threat at the same time. Relief because it validates effort. Threat because it changes who you have to be. So the body reacts. Sleep gets lighter. Focus becomes inconsistent. Motivation feels unreliable. Not because you don't care, but because you care deeply. It's like holding a flame in your hands. You don't want to drop it, but holding it too tightly burns. That's the breaking point. And it often comes with a quiet emotional contradiction, pride and fear existing at the same time. Pride says, "Look how far you've come." Fear says, "Don't mess this up." And when those two voices overlap, the system looks for one thing above all else: relief. For many people, quitting feels like relief. Instantly, the pressure dissolves, expectations drop. The identity gap closes, even if temporarily. And that's why quitting here can feel strangely peaceful at first. But that peace doesn't come from alignment. It comes from contraction. Nothing has gone wrong. This breaking point isn't evidence that you chose the wrong path. It's evidence that the path finally asks something real of you. There's a reason this moment shows up after progress, not before it. Because before there wasn't enough at stake to trigger it. Now there is. And your nervous system is asking a hard question, not verbally, but emotionally. Is it safe to let this matter? Most people don't realize this, but growth requires emotional infrastructure. The ability to hold pressure without interpreting it as danger. To feel fear without obeying it. To sit in uncertainty without escaping it. And that infrastructure develops here, not before. This is the threshold, like standing at the edge of a bridge you've never crossed. Turning back would return you to solid ground you recognize. Stepping forward requires trust in something you haven't embodied yet. The discomfort doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're early. And if you don't quit not through force, but through understanding something begins to shift. The pressure doesn't vanish, but it stops feeling like an emergency. And instead of asking, how do I get away from this feeling? A keyter question starts to form. What if this tension isn't here to stop me, but to prepare me? Because when that question appears, the entire experience changes. And that's where things quietly begin to turn. Eventually, something subtle happens. Not all at once. Not loudly. The tension that once felt sharp begins to soften. Here's the thing. Nothing externally changes in a dramatic way. The work is still there. The responsibility is still real. But your relationship to it shifts. Instead of feeling like something you have to defend yourself against, progress starts to feel like something you can stand inside. Think about that for a second. This is the moment where protection slowly turns into direction. Earlier, your nervous system was guarding you, scanning for threats, pulling energy back, looking for exits. But now, after sitting with the discomfort instead of running from it, the system begins to learn something important. You're still here, and nothing bad happened. That learning doesn't come from thinking. It comes from experience. Psychologists often note that emotional safety is built through exposure, not reassurance. By staying present through uncertainty, the brain updates its threat map. What once felt dangerous begins to feel manageable. So instead of reacting automatically, you start responding. Fear still shows up, but it doesn't dominate the room anymore. Pressure still exists, but it doesn't feel like an emergency. It's like setting something down carefully instead of gripping it with white knuckles. Most people don't realize this, but confidence doesn't arrive before responsibility. It arrives inside it, quietly, gradually. This is where choice re-enters the picture. Earlier, your behavior was driven by relief seeking. Now, it's guided by orientation. Not how do I escape this feeling, but where am I actually going? That question feels calmer, more grounded. It's the difference between bracing for impact and walking forward with awareness. Your nervous system isn't fully relaxed yet, and that's okay. It's recalibrating, like water settling after being disturbed, still moving, but no longer chaotic. Nothing has gone wrong, and nothing needs to be forced. This shift doesn't make you fearless. It makes you steady. And steadiness is what allows growth to become sustainable instead of exhausting. But there's one final piece left, something deeper than strategy or mindset. Because even when the tension softens, there's still the question of who you are becoming inside this new reality. And when that answer begins to form, success stops feeling like something you're chasing and starts to feel like something you're finally inhabiting. That's where everything integrates. And that's where we need to end. At some point, almost without noticing, the ground beneath you stops shifting, not because everything is solved, but because you've settled into it. Here's the thing. This is rarely the moment people imagine when they think about success. There's no surge of excitement, no dramatic relief, just a quiet sense of familiarity. Think about that for a second. The pressure that once felt foreign now feels contextual. It belongs where it is. And so do you. This is what integration feels like. Psychologists describe identity integration as the moment when behavior, self-image, and emotional response begin to align, not perfectly but enough that resistance fades. The nervous system stops asking, "Is this safe?" and starts assuming that it is. You're no longer bracing yourself. You're inhabiting the space you work toward. It's like moving into a house that once felt unfamiliar. At first, every sound stood out. Every room felt temporary. But over time, you stopped noticing the walls. You learned where things belonged. The space became yours. That's what happens here. Effort no longer feels like a performance. Responsibility no longer feels like a threat. Progress no longer feels fragile, not because it can't be lost, but because you trust yourself inside it. Most people don't realize this, but the urge to quit was never about wanting less. It was about wanting relief. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from emotional strain. Relief from carrying something important without feeling ready. And once your internal world catches up, that relief arrives without walking away. Nothing magical changed. You did. The fear didn't disappear, it softened. The doubt didn't vanish, it lost authority. And success stopped feeling like something you had to defend. It simply became part of your environment. This is why people often say, I don't know when it happened, I just realized I was okay. That's integration. And it's important to say this clearly. If you almost quit, that doesn't mean you were weak. It means you were early. Early in learning how to hold something meaningful. Early in becoming someone who could live inside what they built. So if you're still in that earlier stage, the heaviness, the hesitation, the quiet questioning, nothing has gone wrong. You're not broken. You're not behind. And you're not failing. You're becoming familiar with a version of life that once felt distant. And eventually, that version stops feeling like success. It just feels like home.